So I'm going to talk to you today not so much about Euroscepticism or anti-immigration parties. That's one area of my research. I'm more than happy to talk about that with some of you, and I'm going to attend some of these interesting panels that discuss these kind of topics of extremism and anti-EU sentiment. But the kind of second leg of my research, and that's corruption. And corruption is high on my mind, not only because my husband is Spanish, and some of the things that I'm going to allude to you today come from the Spanish example, but actually through the Eurozone crisis, we didn't only see big divergences, and that's what the book on Euroscepticism is about, that, for example, also someone like Stiglitz has outlined in terms of financial, but also in terms of political conditions, that a lot of the southern member states that geared up a lot of problems in the Eurozone crisis also were plagued by corruption scandals. And they might have been there all along and gotten more salience or more kind of attention nowadays. But as I started to work on these areas of Europe, my interest in corruption and if people actually hold a corruption to account became more pressing. So this is one of several papers that I've conducted. One is an overview also of what has been done in political science and economics, actually. That had a lot of sites to work in economics. That's forthcoming in the annual review, which is the electoral consequences of corruption. And this kind of paper that I'm presenting, and it's co-authored work with Hector Zolat, who's also at the University of Essex, comes from the kind of conclusion that we left off in reviewing the literature, as actually that the electoral consequences of corruption are slight, if they exist at all. And the question is why, right? And there's been work on this, and I will review some of it, but it might have not been entirely kind of been able to solve the puzzle of why corruption is punished so rarely, actually, in elections. So I don't think for this audience I have to go through the kind of standards why corruption is important as a topic. The kind of corruption perception index, that's the kind of mainstream index developed by Transparency International based on the lead surveys, outlines that about in 2015, and it's a little higher in 2016, it recently came out, about 6 out of 7.4 billion people live in a problem with a serious corruption problem. So the darker shades of these the countries, the more corruption is prevalent or experts perceive as being prevalent. And there's quite a lot of countries that are like kind of in between, and there's quite some countries that we might shade a little darker. And that might be, for example, the United States. The current administration, I will talk about that in a minute, at least has the potential to be inflicted in a lot of conflict of interest and might even be charged on corruption after 4 years. So corruption is commonly defined as the misuse of public office for private gains. For those of you who are interested in a lot of the work on corruption more generally, Ray Fisman and Miriam Golden put up everything you need to know about corruption. It's forthcoming at OUP this year, and also this overview article that I talked about in the annual review. This is something that is kind of in the news right now. So maybe some of you were interested in learning about Orban. Maybe some of you were interested about the snap election in the UK. But also what was in The Guardian and the FT this morning is the fact that as President Trump met with the Chinese president, two brands of Ivanka Trump got access to the Chinese market. And she has not withheld herself from those negotiations. Her argument is that she's put her company into a trust, but the problem, according to some US lawyers, including the ethics lawyers of Barack Obama, suggests that she might not profit of it now, but she will profit about this in the future. So this constitutes a serious ethics violation. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has also changed the composition of the ethics committee, so we'll see what happens in terms of if this actually comes through politically. But these kind of corruption stories are widespread and also might have fueled some of the anti-establishment rhetoric that we're seeing in many countries today, in the US, the UK, much of Europe. So the conventional wisdom is, sorry, I'm just putting this one here. The conventional wisdom is, especially among political scientists who believe that elections are the instrument to deal with a lot of problems, and I think that view has become increasingly contested, is the sense that elections curb corruption. So this is an overview of a summary of all the polls on the French election, and the French election have also been plagued by 2 corruption scandals, one in the European Parliament involving Marine Le Pen, so the party leader of the Front National, And also Fillon, the leader of the Gaullist, or of the Republicans, as they're called now, the right-wing party, who has been really kind of embroiled in corruption scandals involving, it's kind of known to be Penelope Gate. His wife is called Penelope, and who was given a position and got quite a salary, but apparently never did anything for that salary, or that's the kind of take that the police has on this. So interestingly, actually, when we look recently at the polls, Fillon actually he dipped a little bit, but he was able to kind of hold his ground, and increasingly we see protests in France pro-Fillon. So there's also a discussion maybe that actually if your candidate is embroiled in corruption, this might actually make you dislike the opposition more and rally around your own candidate. Some interesting food for thought. But when we ask people in surveys, and this is actually comes out of a collaboration with a foundation, the Bertelsmann Foundation, where we are doing ongoing polling. It's called EU Opinions within the EU 6 largest member states and the EU 28 as a whole, or well, soon to be 27. This is data from August 2016, asking people how important corruption is as an issue for the vote. We know that unemployment is important. We know that a lot of other issues are important, but here we see corruption. So France is a bit above average. So this is between 0 and 10. It's 6.776, or about 7. In Spain, it's particularly high. Overall, it seems to suggest that when people self-report in surveys that they dislike corruption and that they want to do something about that. However, the reality is that we see a lot of scandals where there might be a slight, maybe some swing voters are not rewarding the incumbent for corruption, but the main voters and the main constituencies of these parties are not moving away from these parties, even though there's clearly been a corruption problem. And this leaves us with a little puzzle that I talked about why is corruption not punished more extensively. This is the Bárcenas scandal in Spain. I said I was going to give some information on Spain, some of the empirical evidences from Spain. This was a scandal involving Luis Bárcenas. Bárcenas was the treasurer of the Partido Popular, so the conservative party in power at the moment and still in power in Spain, involving or being a close tie to Mariano Rajoy, the prime minister. And El País, on the 31st of January 2013, published the so-called Bárcenas Papels, so the papers of Bárcenas, which were these, you see it on the left, these kind of handwritten accounts of how much money was being, of illegal cash donations, went into slush funds on Swiss bank accounts, and actually it had the amounts per politician. So it said Mariano Rajoy got 250,000 or got 2.5 million, right? So it was very, very detailed, and this information was published among a period of time by El País, and the entire file is still online. This created a lot of public outcry. So here is a picture from Madrid where people took to the street and asked for the resignation of the Partido Popular. However, we've seen several elections since then in Spain, and the Partido Popular is still the largest party, has actually been able to gain over the course of these elections, as even more and more corruption scandals were put forward. One could argue, well, PSOE, the biggest opposition, the Social Democrats, were also embroiled locally in corruption scandals. But by 2015, we had two competitors, Ciudadanos and Podemos on the left and the right, that were corruption or clean corruption alternatives. At least that's the way they portrayed themselves. So the question is, if there is this choice, if the information is readily available and also journalists allow you to attribute responsibility correctly, why are people not punishing corruption more extensively? So as I said, this is not a question that has not been dealt with. It's been dealt with, especially it started a lot in economics. Tim Besley's work, for example, on the role of information. So corruption is difficult because politicians hide their corrupt activities, and they have every interest, of course, to do so. And then voters might simply lack the information required to punish an incumbent. This is also put forward by Fearon and Fearon in political science. And information would increase electoral punishment. A very, very famous article on Brazilian audits by Vries and Finan makes that type of argument. And there's also been recently field experiments and survey experiments. The problem is that a lot of the field experiments and survey experiments, especially the field ones that were done in Mexico and providing people with information about audits, actually didn't do much in terms of the election outcome, and if it did anything, it depressed turnout rather than incumbent vote share, right? So people actually might be disillusioned from politics and turn away. So the information might be a story some of the time, but not all of the time. Also, one can think of information environments being too saturated. Many, many corruption scandals coming forward, and then what's that new piece of information going to do? A second answer that was developed both in political science and in economics was the idea that, well, voters weigh a lot of different aspects when they decide to cast a ballot, and corruption is just one of them. And actually, what voters might do is they might trade corruption against other positive policy benefits. For example, like the handling of the economy, like, for example, all other policy positions that they're interested in, and then voters might actually come to the conclusion that they should re-elect a corrupt politician, even though there is a candidate that's clean, and that's simply because they don't care about corruption enough, right? So also here we find mixed evidence. Some studies suggest that this is indeed important. Other studies suggest that, well, the trading off doesn't necessarily always occur. A third group of explanations, and as you see, it's the 3 I's, so information, implicit trade, and in-group loyalty, is what I want to focus on here today. And that might be the case that people might not weigh information of their in-group in the same way as the out-group, and also might not necessarily always be trading off corruption evaluation against policy benefits, but also perhaps non-policy benefits that come simply with a candidate sharing their in-group loyalty. Sharing their in-group identification. And that's something that I want to talk about today. This has already been put forward a little bit if you think about economics now the Pandey and Banerjee's work on ethnic candidates in India. It's a formal model. It was never published. But that kind of idea is what I will develop. I'm not a formal modeler, so you're going to see a lot of experimental evidence rather than theoretical evidence. But that's the kind of the kind of framework that I'm thinking about. So within political science, the idea that in-group loyalty matters, and particularly partisanship, so what it has to do with partisanship, is very, very well established, and that's the idea that partisans engage in so-called in-group serving biases and fail to punish corruption or other forms of malperformance because they simply don't perceive that information to be valid, to be just, to be have any bearing on reality. So the evidence is usually based on observational data and on survey experiments, and there's a lot to say for those. Observational data has a whole lot of endogeneity problems, and survey experiments are one-shot experiments that don't necessarily have any behavioral outcomes, right? And a lot of the implicit trade is actually about how you're going to kind of weigh evaluations by then giving it a behavioral outcome. Yet a lot of these findings that kind of delve into the role of partisanship have in some ways a problem when we want to think about those 3 groups of explanations, information, implicit trade, and in-group loyalty, in the sense that they could actually fit an implicit trade mechanism. People are simply inferring policy positions from partisanship. So how do we know if this is really about information being perceived differently, or about in-group loyalty, or about any of those kind of explanations? So within political science, it's become quite dominant to think of partisanship in 2 ways: as an instrumental variable, and as a more expressive variable. Where instrumental means that a group identity is basically a proxy for a policy benefit. And expressive means that there's a preferential treatment of an in-group versus out-group members without necessarily having to provide a policy benefit. And I will say that that's important for us here for the following reason. So it's important to look and try to hone down on in-group loyalty and make a difference between it being instrumental, i.e. fitting more this trading off idea, versus it being really an expressive explanation, because corruption will be much more costly for candidates if they have to credibly commit to policy programs. If they don't have to do that and just turn an election in an us versus them context, then corruption can, at a certain point, the barrier for corruption is much lower. There's not necessarily a trade-off that needs to be provided. Simply, I can think of a situation, to give it a kind of concrete example, of Artur Mas, who was the president in Catalonia at the time when Pujol, the previous president in Catalonia, was embroiled in a big corruption scandal, even bigger than it involved the Partido Popular, of years and years of money going to Andorra. And the way that Artur Mas dealt with this issue was, remember, we're Catalan, right? Remember why you're voting for us. And not on the basis of some other concern, but on the basis of that we share your in-group loyalty. And that's the kind of mechanism I want to hone down on, and that's the kind of mechanism I try to test. So if we can think of this kind of expressive explanation, there can be two mechanisms underlying it. One could be what's commonly called in political science motivated reasoning, was developed by Tabor and Lodge. The idea that individuals discount information involving their in-group because they might want to avoid an unethical self-image. So if your guy is corrupt, it might say something about you supporting a corrupt guy, i.e. you yourself are corrupt. And what we know from kind of behavioral ethics, so kind of behavioral science approaches to people's ethical behavior, is that this might be an important mechanism. A second mechanism, which comes more from our literature on redistribution, mostly developed within economics, might be that while individuals may assign utility to a group member being better off, even if they themselves are not better off. So the mechanism would be somewhat of an in-group altruism mechanism. And I will hope to say something about these two types of mechanisms. So what I'm going to try to do is to see, well, do we find evidence for this expressive explanation? So a discounting of corruption, even if no policy benefit is provided, and then one of these two mechanisms might seem dominant well, in this case, in a laboratory. So it's very hard to empirically explore these mechanisms. Of course, endogeneity, if we use surveys, evaluations and vote choices are what's the causal direction. But also, as I just talked about in the case of Donald Trump, politicians themselves legislate on corruption, right? So that's very difficult to kind of establish. Then problems of measurement of corruption to begin with. Well, corruption is often hidden. Also, what's seen as corrupt in some country versus another is not necessarily the same. And social desirability, if we ask people, why do you vote for a corrupt politician? They're enough, of course I didn't vote for that particular person, right? So talk is cheap, but we want to look into behavior. So we're trying to utilize some of this by in a causal way, trying to utilize this Bárcenas scandal in Spain and then turning to the laboratory. So the first study, the first evidence comes from Spain, this Bárcenas scandal that I mentioned before. So on the 31st of January in 2013, this Bárcenas scandal broke in El País, the most widely circulated paper in Spain. It uncovered a parallel booking system of the Partido Popular, the incumbent party, for about 20 years that recorded these undeclared and illegal cash donations to Swiss bank account, which were used individually for the politicians as well as for the party. This was exposure. These were these handwritten documents that I showed you before by the party treasurer, and it involved all kinds of high-ranking PP officials, including Aznar, the previous prime minister, and Rajoy, the current prime minister. The interesting thing is that this scandal was released during the fieldwork period of the European Social Survey that was fielded in Spain in the same year. So we're able to create a variable that covers the 2 weeks before. Well, we also do 3 weeks. That's the scandal broke as the survey was in the field for 3 weeks. So we include different kind of cutoff points. But what I'm going to present here is a variable where I'm comparing people who are interviewed 2 weeks before the scandal and 2 weeks after the scandal to see how this information, which was put forward in this newspaper and not discussed earlier in Spanish news, and I will show that in a minute, how that affected their evaluation of the incumbent party, and how partisans of the Partido Popular saw this differently than non-partisans. And I'm also going to talk about the problem of perhaps party identification being affected by the scandal in a minute. We have to think about that. We also ran placebos, just adding kind of other dates in the survey and looking if we find similar effects, and we don't, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So this was the media coverage in El País. The red line is where the scandal broke. The blue line is Bárcenas, and the black line is corruption. Of course, corruption is discussed in Spanish news because there are corruption scandals, and Bárcenas was discussed because he was the party treasurer of the Partido Popular. But what is interesting, even by Spanish scandals, and we see that in these extreme spikes, this was a large-scale corruption scandal, because the majority of corruption scandals in Spain involve public investment in regional parts of Spain, and therefore have never seen this kind of large-scale national corruption scandal in this sense. So in that case, this is also a first in Spanish politics in recent years. So what we see is this is the word count, so how many times corruption or Bárcenas is mentioned above the period, and we see kind of this huge spike that lasts about 2 to 3 weeks. So in order to see if we have balance in our data, i.e. these people who were interviewed 2 weeks before and with 2 weeks after, these are the balance statistics, we see that we have balance on the basis of did you previously vote for Partido Popular, you turned out in previous elections, economic satisfaction, and a whole scale of socio-demographics. However, not on employment, and that's because unemployed people were reached much earlier in the survey. This is because the survey is done face-to-face and by phone, so unemployed people are more likely to be home. We also use matching, nearly neighborhood matching to nearly neighbor matching in order to adjust for that. The results stay the same. So these are the results. That's the treatment variable. So having been interviewed after the scandal, 1, 0 being 2 weeks before. And now the dependent variable is a 0 to 10 rating scale of government approval. And we also include individual covariates, the ones that I just talked about, and regional fixed effects. And what we see is that the scandal, so even for a country in which there is some form of corruption at the local level especially, this scandal had an impact. It had a huge negative impact on approval, almost half percentage and half a point on this scale, and it stays robust across different specifications where we have individual or regional fixed effects. So now to check if Partido Popular voters treat this information about the scandal differently than non-Partido Popular voters, we interact the treatment with a question asking people if they identify with the Partido Popular. And that's 1, all the rest is 0. And also I put this up for government approval as well as economic satisfaction to show you that for economic satisfaction I don't find these results, which is something that we would expect, right? This should affect people's approval of the incumbent, just as also a robustness check. This is just not some fluke that is affecting all kinds of variables in the survey. So here we see the treatment effect being negative. Of course, government identifiers are way more positive about the government. We see the treatment and the interaction with government being statistically significant as well. And now we can compare the treatment effect for opposition partisans, that's the treatment here, and the average treatment effect for government identifiers, which is not statistically significant, but it's even positive. Right? So it's the opposite of what we would expect. Could indicate maybe this kind of in-group altruism that I talked about before. So this also is robust under regional fixed effects, individual covariates, and all forms of matching. And we don't find these results if we have just kind of random other events in the survey. However, one could say, well, this is a first idea that this in-group loyalty might matter, but we can't really control the setting in which the voters get information. The source, it coming from El País, which now is probably a mainstream newspaper, but was traditionally a link to the left, might necessarily not convince these Partido Popular voters. So we can't do that. Also, we can't observe an identical corruption scandal of the opposition, which could not rule out that these government identifiers just never, never punish corruption. And also that we cannot rule out the idea that maybe right-wing voters would not punish corruption. We also cannot rule out that less people self-report as identifiers after the scandal broke. However, this doesn't seem to be a particular problem in this case. I mean, this would be a big problem for the causal identification, because if we want to predict treatment assignment based on your PP partisanship, we can't do that. So in that way, it doesn't seem to be going on, but nonetheless, we can't fully rule it out. We also cannot rule out that other characteristics were traded off against, right? So we're still in this instrumental versus expressive explanation, and we want to kind of hone down in this kind of expressive explanation more clearly. So what I do now is do a similar idea, but do it in the laboratory, where we control the environment, right? So we provide that information, a neutral source provides the information. We create meaningless in-groups based on your preference for Klee and Kandinsky paintings. And people cannot infer any policy positions from that, but also they cannot update their group identity throughout the game because they stay Klees or they stay Kandinskys in the game. So what is a laboratory experiment? We have 2 candidates, 3 voters. They're randomly assigned, and they're fixed to these roles because we don't want them to strategize as they are playing the game. So they play 5 blocks of 5 rounds, and the rounds have 2 parts. The candidates receive 18 tokens at the start of the round, and between 1 and 6 of those are valuable. And the blue tokens are not valuable, the red tokens are valuable, and they're designed for voters because when they are given to voters, they're doubled and equally divided among voters. So candidates know this. Yet candidates can themselves decide how many of these valuable tokens to send to voters. And voters elect a winning candidate by majority as an individual decision based on the information they receive. And this is a non-deception lab, right? This is an economic lab. This is run in Birmingham. Candidates can embezzle by keeping valuable tokens, but they know that voter welfare decreases as a result because the tokens sent by the winning candidate are doubled and equally divided among all voters after the election, right? So if a candidate decides to keep valuable tokens and gets elected, he is not enhancing voter welfare, and he knows that. He's, of course, enhancing his own welfare. That's exactly the kind of dynamic we want to create. However, there is a risk. If these candidates decide to keep valuable tokens, they risk to be caught in a corruption audit, and that's our measure of corruption here. So voters are informed about this corruption of the candidate by an audit. The audit takes place every round and is based on a random flipping of 2 coins. If 1 or 2 of these coins are valuable, the candidate loses all tokens that round. This is to ensure that candidates are sending their valuable tokens to voters, right? These group identities are now invoked, and they're invoked by using a minimal group paradigm. These are soliciting these preferences. We give people 5 Clay and Kandinsky preferences, and if you have three Clays, your Clay, 3 Kandinskys, your Kandinsky. The same goes for candidates, and the same goes for voters. So we're randomly assigning here these group identifications based on people's own preferences, but they cannot change this group identity throughout the game. Of course, we use Clay and Kandinsky because they're not necessarily seen as to be correlated to a whole lot of other factors, and they will also allow us to generalize. If we find it in this kind of minimal group effect, probably in the real world where it's really ethnicity, religion, or other kind of social group identities, we probably can expect these effects to be larger. Of course, we need to control for the number of tokens that voters are receiving as well, and we can do that either by taking the absolute number or the difference between the 2 candidates. So these are the results, and then I will conclude. So these are the results of a panel probit. Remember, we have these repeated rounds, 5 blocks of 5 rounds. We control for round effects, for period effects, for block effects, and these are the results. So the independent variables here are the caught, same identity, the interaction of being caught and same identity, and we control for the difference between candidate 1 and candidate 2 in tokens, right? So it's very similar to the setup of the regression that I showed you before. What we see here that being caught in a corruption audit makes it less likely for voters to elect you. Having the same identity increases the likelihood of being elected by voters, the same for if you provide them with more tokens. But interestingly, we find also a significant interaction between caught and sharing the same ID with that candidate. And now we can again compare the effect of being caught in a corruption audit for candidates with whom you don't share a group identity. So that's that caught effect, that's negative and statistically significant, and a almost negligible 0 effect for caught for candidates with whom you share a group identity. So coming back to the idea, this seems to suggest that there is an expressive explanation as well of in-group loyalty if we take these 2 pieces of evidence together. And what interestingly we seem to suggest is that the caught effect for candidates with whom you share an ID is not positive and statistically significant. It doesn't necessarily seem that it's an in-group altruism mechanism that's going on. Candidates are not being rewarded for becoming richer or enriching themselves. But what rather seems to be going on is that voters are not taking into account this information vis-a-vis a candidate with whom they would not share a group identity. So summing up, why are corrupt politicians sometimes elected and others are not, when information is readily available and when no policy benefits are being provided? So we suggest here that in-group loyalty is crucial. In-group candidates are not punished for corruption while out-group candidates are, and this fits more this expressive idea of in-group loyalty that we talked about rather than this instrumental explanation. And it suggests that voters might simply overlook corruption because they feel this strong pull towards their in-group, even if there's easy information about corruption available and no policy benefits are being provided. And it fits with a lot of work that we've seen in political science that highlights that in-group members just reason differently when it involves an in-group candidate than it involves an out-group candidate. And that's what I wanted to say. So if there are any questions, should I just open the floor up, Michael? Or? Yeah.